All right, my name is Avery Mcdaldno. I'm super excited to be here. I'm also super nervous. It's likely that at some point I'll start hyperventilating and need to just take a moment to catch my breath. Luckily, I'm not doing that right now. This is a talk about queering games, what that means and how we might do it. It's primarily focused on story games. And so before I get started, I just wanted to get a sense of who in the room knows what I mean when I say story games. Can I see a... Cool, so a bunch of people, that's great. For everyone else, story games are games where we generally create characters, role play as those characters, and by engaging with the rules of the game, whether that's rolling dice or interpreting cards or kind of following procedural rules, by engaging with the rules of the game, we create a story together. The reason why I think story games are really vital and important is if I were to approach a lot of my friends or strangers, and I was to say, hey, do you want to sit down and make art together for 4 hours? Or, hey, do you want to tell a story together on the fly right now? They would say no, because any rational person would probably say no to that invitation out of the blue. But if I say, hey, do you want to sit down and play a story game? It only takes about 3 hours. For some reason, they're willing to do almost the exact same activity because I use the word game. And so I think that there's this kind of great quality that story games have where people will play them and they will end up creating amazing art and creating amazing stories and surprising themselves with kind of where their creativity can take them. And so it's for that reason that I'm really excited about story games. I'm also going to talk about video games a little bit. Imagining ourselves, queer mechanics and games. Before I click the next slide, I just wanted to say thanks to Thom Kiraly and Chris Jonasson for having me out here and for arranging my trip here. If anyone wanted to applaud them, that would be super exciting. Okay, so I think that as queer people, we deserve to see media that celebrates us, that not just includes us as bit characters or kind of cute villains, but media that validates our lives, our stories, our flaws, our strengths, the fact that we are beautiful and weird and have important things to say. I think games are a really important type of media because many types of media, whether we're talking about television or movies or comics or theater or the list goes on, they let us imagine new environments and they let us see characters in those new environments, whether we're talking about science fiction worlds or just kind of situations that we haven't personally been in ourselves, like maybe losing a sibling and as a family grieving over that loss. Whatever the case might be, lots of different types of media let us explore new situations. Games let us actually enter those situations and practice surviving in them and practice thriving in them. And they let us train at being humans. And I think that's really exciting and really special. And it's for that reason that story games have an immense potential. I'm doing that hyperventilating thing I warned you about. Story games have an immense potential for that reason to be a practice of queer world building. And by that I mean be a practice of, as queer people sitting down and imagining a better world, as queer people sitting down and practicing bringing that world into existence, as queer people sitting down and exploring our ideas and seeing whether they actually work in an imaginary space. Yes, but we're still testing our ideas out. We're still learning, we're still growing, we're still developing, and we're still challenging each other to be better humans. And that's why I'm really excited to talk about games in specific, as opposed to any old media of any old sort. It's because of the practice they let us have at being human and being queer. So with that said, where do we find the queerness in games? I think the easiest answer is to talk about queer representation. And I have here an example of queer representation that I think was done really, really well. This is a character from the game Pathfinder. Are people here familiar with Pathfinder? A bunch of heads nodding. Cool, so Pathfinder, for anyone who isn't familiar, is a game similar to Dungeons & Dragons. You're heroes, you kill monsters, you take their treasure. Pathfinder has a series of iconic characters, they're called, which are just their central characters that you see in a lot of their products. The most recent one they've unveiled is Shardra Geltel, who is a Dwarven woman who was raised as a Dwarven boy, who felt really ostracized and rejected in her community, until she realized that she had this amazing ability to channel kind of elemental powers. And up until that point in her life, she'd been an outcast and someone who wasn't really well understood by the Dwarven community she belonged to. And it's the fact that she went out and she kicked major ass and she saved her whole village that made everyone start paying attention to her and start considering her experiences and identity as real. And it's really cool art. So I think when we're talking about queer representation, Shardra Geltel is a great example of how to do queer representation right. The question is queer representation enough? Should that be our goal in queering games? And should we, as queer people or queer designers or people advocating from a space of allyship, should we be looking to create queer representation alone? And I think the answer is no. I think that including LGBT characters, and in Swedish I believe the equivalent would be HBTQ characters? Cool. Including LGBT characters in the telling of stories that reinforce cultural norms about the triumph of a dominant class, taking LGBT characters and using them to tell stories about how some people are worth recognizing as heroes and some people aren't. I don't really think that's queer games. And I don't think as queer people that we should settle for counting that as the entirety of our success. Queer representation is great, but alone it's not enough. We need to be queering more than just the cover art of games. And I think that the reason that we need to queer more than just the cover art of games is the games aren't slideshows, they aren't collections of character portraits, they aren't just books of art, though a lot of the books have red art. But at their core, games are systems. Systems are built out of mechanics, and it's important to acknowledge, both in the context of games and when we're talking about the rules and laws that govern our real lives, that systems aren't objective or neutral. They're built out of designers' biases, assumptions, prejudices, and norms. All mechanics and all rules reinforce worldviews and they reinforce politics, usually unexamined politics, politics that the designer wasn't thinking about. When we consider games and game systems, what that's doing is that's taking us from the realm of, oh, you can tell a story about anything, to something that's more constrained, that's probably more, as a result, more meaningful, more engaging, more accessible, but as a result also more biased and more prejudiced, and more reinforcing of the way we think about stories, the way we think about capacity, the people we think of as important or not important. All mechanics reinforce worldviews in politics. We haven't been talking about the fact that a lot of designers are heteronormative. We haven't been talking about the fact that a lot of mechanics are built out of heteronormative assumptions. And so up until this point, we've been playing straight games. And I don't think that advancing a demand for queer mechanics is weird or is out of line or is something new that I'm suggesting that we bring to games. We've been playing straight games. It's time we play some queer games. I think one of the things that games do, the game systems do, is they can mirror real-world systems. The rules of a game can help shed light on the rules of real life. And that's true whether we're talking about a game that's very mundane, very serious, very emotional, very grounded in the real world, or if we're talking about elves in space with magical lightning bolt powers. Either way, the systems that we use to tell those stories can still tell us things about the systems that we navigate in the real world, as queer people and just as humans. Games let designers codify and share their experiences, their realities, their hopes, their fears, and their dreams. That's true of... Hey, little fella. That's true of, I think, a lot of media, maybe all media. But what games do is they let us share the decision points that we have in our lives. They let designers share with audiences, this is what it means to be in my shoes and to be making decisions as someone like me. And so I have an example of that. This is a game called Dog Eat Dog. It's by Liam Burke. It's really groundbreaking and difficult and challenging, and if you have a chance to buy it ever, I suggest buying it. Dog Eat Dog is a game about colonialism. Specifically, it's set in the Pacific Islands, so Southeast Asia, Hawaii, that kind of area. And you play natives on an island that is just in the early stages of being colonized. It's a game about colonialism, imperialism, and assimilation. And playing Dog Eat Dog was really scary for me as a white person. As a person, I live in North America, and so I live on unceded native territory as an occupying person, and so that's very difficult for me to kind of come to terms with. It's very difficult for me to think about colonialism. One of the things Dog Eat Dog does is the game is the mechanics of the game are structured around a set of rules that are understood between the two societies that you're playing out in the game, the colonizers and the colonized. And the first rule, the one that the book says always goes into play, is that the native population is in some way known to be inferior to the colonial occupation forces. Which Liam Burke, writing as a Pacific Islander person living in America, obviously doesn't think that. That is a tool used to explore what colonialism feels like. And when we sat down to play it, and we talked about that rule, and we introduced more rules that were existing between the two societies in the game, there's also this set of tokens that are around the table. And when you disobey rules, you lose tokens. And when you obey rules, the colonial force gives you tokens. And I, as a gamer, sitting down to play this game, was like, oh, sweet, I want to get all the tokens. And I was cognizant of the fact that we were playing a game about colonialism, but I was also like, I want to win this game, and I want to get all the tokens. And it turns out it's really, really easy to win the game and to get all the tokens as a native person in Dog Eat Dog. All you need to do is just prove the rules to be true all the time, and you win in 2 turns. And then they leave your island. It's great, and except that you have to internalize all of the oppression that the game sets up, and you have to become your own kind of colonizing force. And it was that, oh gosh, I just want these tokens, and I just want them to leave, so I'll win. That gamer impulse in me, kind of confronting the fact of what it would mean to win this game in that way, was kind of like a startling moment. And I'd heard people talk about internalized oppression before, and I'd heard people talk about kind of the construct of model minorities before, and I kind of, on some level, cerebrally understood it. But to be in that place, to have Liam Burke kind of outline in that way and ask me to make a decision about it, helped me understand that experience in a way that I hadn't understood before playing Dog Eat Dog. I think that's an example of the way that games can help us share our experiences and share the systems that we have to navigate with one another, and build empathy and build solidarity across identities and across experiences. That said, I want to jump into, to return from talking about colonialism to returning to talk about queer identities and ask, what do queer systems look like? If I've suggested that queer representation isn't enough and we need to be playing games that are structurally queer, what does that mean? And I think that can mean a lot of different things. I have two different ideas that I want to talk about. The first is the idea of using mechanics to build structures of queer utopia and to tell stories of queer utopia. This is a still from the game Hugpunx by Merritt Kopis. Merritt is a queer trans woman. Her work is really amazing. A lot of it's free online, so I recommend checking it out. Hugpunx is described as a neon queer urban hug simulator. You're on this street, people mill about, and throughout the game, people signal that they would love a hug. They go green, they light up, And you can run over and you can hug them. And when you do, they say nice things to you, and flowers grow in the street. Everyone's really happy. More people signal that they would like hugs. Hug enough people, and then cats start showing up, and all the cats want to be hugged. Some people don't want to be hugged, and you can't hug them. This is like a consent-based hug simulator. But there's lots and lots of people of lots and lots of genders who want to be hugged. There's no way to fail at this game. No one ever disappears before you have a chance to hug them. You never struggle to navigate the street because of hidden or visible disabilities. You never grow tired. You never experience street harassment. This is just a game where you run around and hug everyone and feel a sense of just love in the air and solidarity and community and vibrance and flowers, and the whole world explodes in happy pixels. And it's really, really nice. So that's one possibility for what queer games could look like. I have here an example that is very different. Has anyone here played Apocalypse World? Everyone else should as well. Apocalypse World is a world that is not nice, where if you go around trying to hug people in the streets, well, that's possible, you will experience harassment. Probably also there will be gunshots. Also, you're starving and probably dying of several diseases simultaneously. Apocalypse World is a bad place to live. But it's also a place where queer resistance has become pervasive, and queer resistance is winning. It's a world where bashing back has become the norm. And that's both in terms of kind of the flavor of the setting, but also the mechanics. One of the core principles of the game that a lot of the rules are designed around is that there are no status quos in Apocalypse World. And so while there is violence and there are people trying to take what isn't theirs constantly, the structures that uphold power are constantly being dismantled in Apocalypse World. And so it's a very different game than Hugpunx. And I think the two represent different ends of kind of a spectrum of what queer games can look like. And I think there's a lot of different other points too. I don't think it's a linear spectrum. Those are two possibilities that this little guy thinks are pretty cool. So that said, I want to go from talking about queer systems to the building blocks of queer systems. I want to imagine some queer mechanics and imagine ways that designers can build things from the ground up in a way that is queer. So I've got 6 different kind of mechanical ideas, and from each I'm going to spring into talking about different games that have done something interesting with these mechanical ideas. Some of them are queer in the sense that they are written by queer authors, and if you ask the authors, they would agree that it was a queer game. And some are queer in the sense that I think they are, and whatever the author thinks doesn't matter as much as what I think. So the first is the Fruitful Void. The Fruitful Void is an idea first proposed by Ron Edwards and later explained and extrapolated from by Vincent Baker. Before I encountered the idea of the Fruitful Void, I would have said that games are about whatever the mechanics are about. And that seemed like there could be no other solution in my mind. And so Dungeons & Dragons had rules mostly about fighting, so it was a game about fighting. Vampire the Masquerade, well, a lot of the books spent a lot of time talking about how they were definitely about the struggle to retain one's humanity when there's a monster within you. The rules were all about fighting, so the game was about fighting. The Fruitful Void challenged that and suggested a more nuanced definition that games are about whatever the mechanics point towards and circle around without ever actually defining. That the game is about whatever it makes you think about and it makes you question and it makes you struggle for without actually giving you the tools to define concretely. So one of the examples, I talked about Apocalypse World earlier. That designer, Vincent Baker, also wrote a game called Dogs in the Vineyard. Also a really great game. In Dogs in the Vineyard, you are young agents of faith who are in kind of a early days settler colonial territory, kind of a Wild West territory. You've got your Bible, you've got your gun, you've got a really cool coat, you've got a bunch of mail to deliver to small towns that don't get a lot of travelers other than you. And when you show up, you deliver the mail, you do funeral rites and wedding rites and birth rites, and also you root out sin and you kill sinners. And you're 19, you have no life experience. It's you probably do a really bad job in a lot of towns. And so as you play Dogs in the Vineyard, you show up in town, you do your best, you screw up, and then you just move on to the next town and you do it again. And you move on to the next town and you do it again. And the Fruitful Void comes into play with Dogs in the Vineyard in that the game is about kind of that challenge of whether or not you retain your faith in what you're doing as you roll from town to town, screwing up and trying to get better. And nowhere in the mechanics of the game, or maybe even the book, is there a reference to your faith. You don't have a faith stat. You don't track how close you are to your Lord. The mechanics are all about conflict. They're all about how badass your coat is, how big your gun is, and faith is that fruitful void the mechanics of the game and the play of the game is constantly circling around but never giving you any answers to. I feel like the fruitful void is like the queerest idea in game design theory that I've ever encountered, and that despite our love of complicated identity labels and of using vocabulary to help give structure and definition and new meaning to our lives, queerness is ultimately about exploring fruitful voids and about circling those nebulous, unknown areas that we haven't been given a lot of experience in defining. And so how do you intentionally build games around the fruitful void? I have an example. This is a game I designed. It's called Monsterhearts. Monsterhearts is a game about teenagers who are also monsters. And you're dealing with the fact that you just became a werewolf really recently, and you've changed 3 or 4 times, and you've eaten a couple people. Also, you're going through puberty. And the two are related to a certain degree, but they're also very different experiences. And in Monsterhearts, one of the things that's going on is that you as a character are realizing like you have a body and you have a sexuality, and those things have power, and you don't quite understand how they work yet fully, but you know the power is really important. So it's a game about using your body and sexuality to get power in a high school environment. And the mechanics of the game all point towards this resource called strings, which is the power you have over other people's hearts. And the mechanics all point towards strings. The way that everyone gets strings, it varies, but we all have this one common way of getting strings, which is turning people on. And the game gives a lot of mechanical weight to turning people on, to getting power over them, and to playing with sexuality in play. But nowhere on your character sheet is there a space for you to write down what your sexuality is, what or who you're attracted to, what or who you present yourself as. Sexuality is the fruitful void of the game. The mechanics all circle around without ever giving a chance for the players to define. So the fruitful void is the first idea. The second idea is having fluid characters who are in flux and in transition, and whose uncertainty is hard-coded into them. Queer lives are often, when we compare to heteronormative ideals of wealth accumulation, building family, acquiring resources, and the retroactive, I'm going to not even bother to say that word. Compared to those ideals, queer lives are unexpected, fluid, changing, multi-directional, and cloudy. Our diversity is not well reflected in linear and hierarchical mechanics like stats and levels, starting at level 1, having a strength of 18, continuing to succeed in the world as a hero until you are level 20 and have a strength of 24. I don't think that does justice to telling stories about queer lives. So how do we do something different? Kingdom is a game about a community at a critical juncture, at a moment where they have to kind of decide where as a community and where as a collection of people they go forward. And one of the important mechanics of Kingdom is that everyone has one of 3 roles. So maybe I'm the perspective, and you're the touchstone, and you're the power. And I, as a perspective, can predict the future of our community, and you as the touchstone can tell us what the people want, and you as the power can make choices about what our community does. And so we all have these different roles that give us different types of power, and that's interesting. But the more interesting thing in Kingdom is that I can take touchstone away from you, and you can take perspective away from me, and we can compete for these roles. And so we have characters who are constantly changing their position within the community and their capacity to affect change within the community. Another example is the game Silver and White by Jackson Tegu. Has anyone here heard of Silver and White? Cool. More people should hear about it, I think. More people should play it. Silver and White is a game about 4 suburban teenagers. It's a game about them encountering a mystery that will forever change their lives. But it's also just about being a teenager and being confused and feeling trapped and being uncertain about who you are, kind of at your core. And the most interesting thing about the mechanics in my mind is that every player has 2 cards. The first one looks something like this. It tells you what your emotional state is. And the second one looks nothing like this and tells you what you as a player have narrative control over, whether you get to define what's on the photographs, which are an important thing, whether you get to be the narrator, whether you get to define what the machine does, another important thing. And these cards start with us, but as the characters interact, and specifically whenever the characters touch, cards are swapped. And so I'm filled with desire, you're frustrated, and when we touch, that swaps. And now I'm frustrated and you're filled with desire. And you go off and you bump into someone else, and you were the narrator, and now they're the narrator. And we keep on trading cards like this throughout the game. And what that means is that the things that make us mechanically different from one another and the things that are concrete and known about us, we know that they're temporary and that they're ephemeral and that we're going to lose them and become a totally different person within 20, 30 minutes. So the third idea is character non-monogamy. And what that phrase means is games where the relationship between players and characters isn't one-to-one. So it's not a game where I have my character, you have your character, you have your character, and you have yours. It's games where we all trade characters, or where I have 2 characters and everyone has 2 characters, or we play through characters in rapid succession. Whatever the configuration is, it's a departure from the norm of one player, one character. I think this is really important because the one player, one character ownership model is fine enough as a single model among many, but when it's the only model and when it's the dominant model, it does this really frustrating thing where it asks us to focus our stories on how important and powerful and enlightened and privileged a few people are, and to focus our stories away from talking about communities and collaboration and relationships and contexts and the ways histories evolve, the way that physical spaces evolve. And ultimately that character ownership model, if it's the only model we have for telling stories, means we're telling stories about kind of a dominant privileged class. So character non-monogamy allows us to challenge that and to tell different types of stories that grant agency in different ways. So the first example I want to talk about of character non-monogamy is the game Bliss Stage. Bliss Stage is by Ben Lehman. In this game, all of the adults just died. Like, it happened today. We're a group of like 13-year-olds, 14-year-olds. We've retreated into this like underground bunker. We're all that's left. We're going to determine the fate of humanity. These aliens that are invading us, super big, super powerful. The only weapon we possibly have to defeat them is to pilot these giant dream warrior things with weapons built out of our relationships with one another. Very weird and exciting game. What Bliss Stage does is at the start, you talk about where your underground cell is, how big it is, how many characters there would likely be. Are you the survivors of a boarding school? Are you the survivors who happen to be on this one bus going back from summer camp? Are you whoever was on that beach that day? Whatever, you decide who was there when the incident happened, and then you create those characters. And then you collectively play those characters, and you trade off as makes sense. And if we really care about exploring the relationship between Gwen and Thom, then we focus a lot on Gwen and Thom, and everyone has a chance to play Gwen and Thom. And if Gwen doesn't turn out to be that important, if the Thom, Peter, and Jacob relationships become really, really important, then we all take turns playing them instead. So that's Bliss Stage. A different example of character non-monogamy comes up in The Quiet Year. This is a game I wrote, which, by the way, after we're done talking, we do questions. I have copies if anyone wants to buy one. But The Quiet Year is a game about a community that has survived an apocalypse together, similar to Bliss Stage in that way. But it's different in that none of us play characters at any point, really. The game centers around a map and around a community that inhabits that map. And when we talk as the collective distilled voices of a community. And so when I share my opinions, I might be speaking as one community member, or a dozen, or most of the community members. When I declare that the community takes action, it's not really clear what percentage or what faction of the community is taking action, just that action is occurring. And so we see a story told from the map's point of view. So another site for the possibility of queer mechanics is in mechanics that center around explicit power dynamics between different characters. It's often taboo to talk about the power dynamics that govern our relationships, and I think it's especially taboo to play around with those power dynamics, whether that's reversing them, whether that's playing them earnestly and authentically and dangerously, whether that's exploring them in kind of a camp or silly or facetious or satirical way, whatever the case might be. We're definitely not ever supposed to talk about the fact that there is power involved in relationships, and so as a result, there's a site for queer exploration there. We can use mechanics to reveal and challenge the way power differentials operate in our real-world relationships, and to imagine what different configurations and arrangement of power between people might look like in the world. And so the example I have is Hot Guys Making Out. And I understand that earlier this week a couple people here played Hot Guys Making Out. Is that, yeah? Hot Guys Making Out is a really good game. It's tells the story set in the Pyrenees during the Spanish Civil War, the budding relationship between Gonsalvo, a young, timid man, nervous to ever really talk about his feelings, but brimming up with emotion constantly. He's nervous, he's clumsy, he's inexperienced, he wants to do well at everything. The relationship between Gonsalvo and Honore was passionate, bold, and decisive, and when he takes action, he succeeds. And the way the game is played is you go around playing cards onto the table, and Gonsalvo, whenever he plays any old card, he can narrate his feelings or his inner monologue. He just can't really act or do anything. He can do that when he plays a heart, but normally on a regular card, it's just feelings and emotions and ideas. Honore is the exact opposite. Whenever he plays any old card, he can take bold, decisive action. He can pick Gonsalvo up and carry him out of that burning building. He can ride a stallion off into the sunset. He just can't talk about how he feels, except for when he plays a heart. And so Hot Guys Making Out is all about exploring the relationship between someone who is in a kind of a position of greater power, and two people who have different types of agency and different ways of navigating their agency, and explores those two roles and the way that a relationship might form between them, while also giving the characters moments to transcend those limitations that they have. I think this is the fifth mechanical idea. It's that of fluctuating meanings, or having mechanics mean many things at once, or mechanics that mean something different from scene to scene. think this is a queer idea because our identities and their expressions are layered, they're complicated, they mean many things at once. We use signifiers that mean a lot of different things in a lot of different contexts. Signifiers that we probably hope don't mean a lot when moving through straight society, and hope mean a lot when we're surrounded by queer babes who we want to see us and recognize us and, you know, make out with us later. Our lives are not well expressed in mechanics that have fixed, singular definitions. So I'm going to turn to talking about Monsterhearts here. In Monsterhearts, you're teenagers who are monsters. And when I say you're teenagers who are monsters, I mean two things by that. The first is that, like, you're monsters in the sense that every teenager is sort of a monster. And the second is that, no, like, you're literally actually a monster. And so if you're a vampire, that means you tend to be very predatory. You tend to latch onto other people's weakness in order to make yourself feel okay about who you are. It also means that, like, you can't go in the sunlight and you drink blood. And when you play the game, the fact that it's mostly set in high school and it's set in regular high school classrooms and, you know, your high school dodgeball class, whatever the case might be, most of the time you're metaphoric monsters. You're just teenagers with problems, and we're giving you new vocabulary to talk about those problems, like vampire, werewolf, whatever. And then sometimes shit hits the fan and things get really real and people are literally biting each other or disappearing or walking through walls or casting spells on one another. And part of what makes the game interesting is that you move back and forth between those literal and metaphoric definitions of monster, and you move back and forth without a lot of warning. The sixth place for queer mechanics to emerge that I've identified is in using mechanics to enshrine the preposterous. And what I mean by that is that games don't need to be physics engines. I think the fact that our heritage as gamers comes from war games and video games has given us the sense that everything needs to be really realistic and everything needs to be really rational, and that if you're a character who has really heavy armor, then you need to sink faster than other people would if your character falls into water. Like, it needs to be that way. And I think it's important to recognize that it doesn't need to be that way. That we get to, as designers, as players, we get to decide how our worlds work. And we get to decide that they can be as weird as we want, as liminal, as subjective, as preposterous, as silly, as personal, as autobiographical, as selfish as we want. And there's nothing in games, there's no pre-existing a priori agenda of games that says otherwise. We can approach the absurd through camp. We can approach the absurd through hypersincerity, through taking things very, very seriously, although it makes zero sense. And I think that when we do this, when we enshrine the preposterous, what we're doing is we're training ourselves to take a wider diversity of lived experiences seriously. And we're training ourselves to be better at recognizing one another as valid. So I have here a game by Anna Anthropy. It's called The Hunt for the Gay Planet. It's a game about it's a hypertext-based video game. It's about just getting fed up with Earth and realizing that you need to go and find that planet that you've heard of out there, the one where everything's gay all the time, everyone's happy, there's awesome gay sex all the time, everyone validates you, there's no abuse, there's no struggle, it's just awesome, 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 gay, gay, gay all the time. Anyways, that planet is called Lesbionica, and it's out there, you're sure of it. And so you and your rad girlfriend go off into the stars to find Lesbionica, so that you can be truly happy and truly gay. And I think that, and there's lots of like really kind of like smutty, perverted content throughout the game. It's very crude and crass, and intentionally so. And I think one of the things that The Hunt for the Gay Planet does is it takes a stand, and it's the author saying, you know what, actually what I want is valid. I know what I want doesn't make sense. I know that Lesbiana can't possibly exist. It's a stupid dream, but it's my dream and I want it. And so I'm going to tell stories about it, and they're going to matter, and you're going to take them seriously. And I think that's really defiant and exciting. So yeah, The Hunt for the Gay Planet, you can find it, you can play it online, it's free. It's weird. Another game that I want to talk about is Superhero by Jackson Tegu. Superhero is a game about Superhero, who's this total badass. And he's got this high-powered rifle, and he's got this like burned-out car, and it's riddled with bullet holes. And every bullet hole it acquires, for some reason, just seems to make it drive better and like cooler. And it's okay if you lose your gun, because you're Superhero. You've got guns everywhere. Like there's another gun under your seat. You go back to your house, just guns everywhere. If you run out of guns, you can buy more. You've got money. You've in fact got suitcases full of millions of dollars. And like a lot of suitcases, because you're really good at what you do. And they're just kind of like suitcases full of money whenever and wherever you need them, because you're Superhero. And Superhero does this thing where it returns to that time when you were 10 years old, before you got cynical. And it says, you know what, those stories, like, they were fun. We liked those stories. We like those stories way more than we like our current stories. And like, those stories are still allowed to count. Like, they can still be valid. We can still tell them. We can still be Superhero. We can still describe that car that makes no sense. It's okay. We're allowed. So I've talked about 6 possibilities for queer mechanics and ways to use mechanics to build queer systems. And just to go over them again briefly, there's really intentionally exploring the fruitful void, really intentionally exploring the way that rules are built around nebulous things that aren't ever defined. And as designers and as people playing games, kind of hunting for that nebulous void and then protecting it, keeping it a void. The second was creating fluid characters that are, by the structure of the game, constantly changing, constantly in flux, who are allowed to be uncertain. The third was ways of structuring games so that we're not all attached to our one character, our one little dude, and instead we're invited to explore relationships, communities, landscapes, histories. The fourth was exploring explicit power dynamics and using the rules of games to look at the way power exists in our real world relationships and the way power might exist in other relationships. The fifth was creating games that have mechanics that mean many things and that fluctuate in meaning, mechanics that are not pinned down, mechanics that leave room for us to make interpretations and impose our own subjectivities moment to moment. And the sixth was making games about silly things, making games about absurd things, making games that are preposterous and saying, that's okay, we're allowed to make things that are preposterous, they still count. So this is my final slide, and then we have like 4 minutes for questions. I should have talked faster. So I wanted to leave on kind of like a challenge or something for you all to do, because I've already done my part. The challenge is to find the queerness in games, and when you find it, bring more queerness to them. And I think there's maybe 3 ways that I see of doing that. And the first is advocating for queer representation. Although I glossed over it really quickly, I think that representation is important. The second, though, are to design games that are mechanically queer. Who here designs games? Okay, there's like no reason why the rest of you couldn't also put your hands up. You all have permission to design games. Your games are going to be really good. Your brain works differently than every other brain in the world, which means you're going to design something that's amazing and that's unprecedented and that couldn't exist without you. And it'd be really cool if you all design games. And it'd be really cool if you all design games that are mechanically queer. Finally, as players, there are still lots of ways to queer games through play. Regardless of the structure of the games, there are ways to bring that queerness and deploy it within games as players. I don't know how to do that. That's not my job to figure out. I put slides and notes and links to all the games there. There's my Twitter. It's a terrible Twitter. Don't follow it. And there's my email. It's a great email. Email me. Okay, so we have time for questions, so long as we keep them brief. What questions do people have? Yes.
How do you feel about exploring queer communities within a normative world? Because you do talk about that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. When I design games about queer people, I tend to set them in the post-apocalypse, and I think that's like a failing on my part, because I think that I'm taking the easy road out of just imagining a world where people have already done the work of creating queer space, and so I don't have to think about it as much. And I, as a designer, should probably think more about designing games where kind of queerness exists within normative worlds. I think Monsterhearts does that a little bit.
Yeah.
In that you play teenagers who are monsters, and you definitely can't let people know about that. And so you're constantly trying to hide and kind of process through shame, which isn't a universal queer experience, but I think for a lot of queer youth is like a really difficult, pervasive kind of experience to go through. So yeah, I'm really excited about the idea of games kind of giving people the tools to tell stories about queer people navigating heteronormative worlds. And I don't do that enough as a designer. I probably should, and more people should.
Thank you.
Yes, I'm thinking about my own gaming experiences, and the most interesting characters I've played are not the ones like going from level 1 to level 20, the linear sort of development. It's when I am at LARPs and can do a character that has a really complicated path. And I feel that I'm more at liberty to do so in a LARP content than in a role-playing session for some reason. But how do you think we can design more games that, mechanically gives us this complex? You talked some about it, but I want to know more.
Yeah, I think that the reason that...
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, yeah. So the question, there are two parts to the question. I was asked to repeat it just so the microphone could catch it. I think the first part was talking about the difference between LARPs and kind of tabletop games, and the way that LARPs seem to be better at giving you space to tell stories that aren't always about kind of driving the plot, and that allow you kind of more space to just explore who your character is in like a moment-to-moment way. And I think that part of the reason for that is that tabletop games tend to fall into the same trap that Hollywood movies do, of thinking about like stories as only being good and exciting and valid if they're constantly ramping up in excitement level. And so if you have a car chase and there's an explosion, then you definitely have to have 2 explosions in the next car chase, and then there has to be a car chase with like a skyscraper explodes. And now every like dramatic character dialogue has to happen during a car chase as well, and you just kind of keep on ramping up. That example doesn't exist, obviously, but you kind of keep ramping up in excitement because you're not really sure what else to do. And because I think like for some reason it feels like a failure to say like, all right, now my character's napping. And I wish it didn't feel like it was like some kind of failure. Like I wish we had, I wish we were just okay with having stories that meandered and that wandered about and that kind of ebbed and flowed in excitement levels. One of the games that I have here is Ribbon Drive, which is a game about people going on a road trip and kind of discovering themselves and learning to let go of stuff. And I designed it specifically because I was getting frustrated with the fact that all the games I played were about action, 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 and like more. And I wanted a game that was about just like less. And so it's a game about like coming into this road trip and getting into this car with all these expectations, and then just kind of like letting them go and just like chilling out. And so, yeah, I've got that game if you want to take a look at it. There was another part to your question, though, I think.
I don't know. I'm so...
Well, that's the answer to the first part of the question.
Thank you so much.
I think we have one more question.
Well, right now the games industry, the indie market is kind of like blowing up at the moment with like games trying new things, such as like LGBT themes and queer themes and things like that. But how do you feel that the more established, like the more mainstream market is in how good are they at representing the LGBT themes at the moment?
They're terrible. Yeah. The question was acknowledging the fact that independently designed games tend to be a lot better at advancing equality and pushing the bill in terms of design and representation, and how does that relate back to kind of the industry being a little bit stuck. And I think the answer is that like the industry is stuck. Some companies are better than others. Paizo, who does Pathfinder, I showed an example. I think Paizo do a really good job of pushing for better representation as an industry leader. In general, though, the way industries work is that they are dinosaurs who are constantly on the verge of being obsolete, and they wait for independent creators and people who don't have power to innovate, and then they steal that. So if we're worried, like I don't think we need to be worried about, I don't think we need to be as worried as we currently are about focusing all of our attention on fixing the big companies, because we can just wait until they notice us and steal what we're doing. And on that bleak note, that's all the time. I have games if you want to buy them. I have 2 games, Ribbon Drive and The Quiet Year. And there's another panel going on in here, so I'll have them in the lobby. It was really nice to talk to you all. Hopefully some of you come up and introduce yourselves to me later. Okay, bye.